She had never felt fear like this before. The door slammed behind Annie Monroe as her estranged husband, Damon Caldwell, stood there with a cold smirk on his face. His voice was calm, but his words cut like knives. He threatened that if she did not leave town on her own, he would make sure she never saw her daughter, Maris, again. Annie had lost count of how many times he had used these tactics. But this time, something was different. She was tired, broke, and at her lowest point. She felt as if she was running out of strength to go on. She had spent her last few dollars on a plane ticket to Seattle for a legal meeting that might change her life. She clutched Maris's faded pink hair ribbon in her hand, remembering how her daughter had given it to her for good luck the day everything fell apart. Annie's fingers shook as she held it tight. She promised herself she would not give up, no matter what. For a moment, Annie did not move. She just stared at Damon, whose eyes held a mix of anger and twisted delight. His threats had worked before. He had made sure that the court saw her as an unfit mother when their marriage first fell apart. She had lost almost everything. Now, she was fighting with all she had to regain custody of Maris. Everything depended on a judge believing her side of the story, which was set to be heard in Seattle. If she lost this chance, she might never see her daughter again, and Damon was counting on that fear to keep her silent. Annie swallowed hard and finally pushed past him, her old suitcase clutched in her hand. She was done listening to him. She was going to fight for her child. Still, as she walked away, Damon's quiet laugh echoed in the hallway. She did not look back, but inside, her heart pounded with worry. She knew he was not finished trying to ruin her life. With dread filling her heart, she left for the airport, thinking of Maris every step of the way. 3 hours later, Annie sat on a nearly full airplane bound for Seattle. She sank into her seat, grateful she had found a last-minute economy ticket. She had spent the last of her small savings. She had no idea where she would stay once she arrived. She would figure that out later. At least the flight would give her a chance to rest. She could not remember the last time she had managed a full night's sleep. She often spent late nights working part-time jobs or doing chores for neighbors to make extra money. There was no room in her budget for comfort, and there was no time for anything except the fight for her daughter. She fastened her seatbelt and glanced at the man seated next to her. He wore a tailored business suit, and his wristwatch looked more expensive than her car. Annie felt a bit out of place. Her own clothes were thrift store finds, and her shoes had tiny holes near the toes. Yet, he gave her a small, polite smile. She offered one back, though she could not help noticing that he seemed tense, like he was carrying a weight in his mind. She wondered if everyone carried secrets and worries. Maybe she was not so alone after all. As the plane took off, Annie closed her eyes. The soft hum of the engine lulled her toward sleep. She did not want to be rude to her seatmate, but her exhaustion was stronger than her fears. In her half-awake state, she felt her head dipping forward. She tried to jerk back upright, but she was just too worn out. She soon leaned to the side and felt something firm but warm under her cheek. She was too tired to understand what was happening. Before she could move away, the man next to her gently shifted, allowing her head to rest on his shoulder. She tried to wake up enough to apologize, but her body refused to listen. She murmured a soft sorry, and then she let go of the world around her. When Annie opened her eyes, she realized at once she had been sleeping on a stranger's shoulder. She shot upright, face burning with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry," she mumbled. "I must have dozed off." He smiled in a calm way. "Don't worry about it. You looked like you needed the rest." She noticed his eyes then. They were blue, but they held a hint of sadness. He looked at her like he understood her tiredness more than she might guess. It was strange, but Annie did not feel as awkward as she thought she would. Something about him was sincere. "I'm David," he said, extending a hand. She shook his hand. "Annie," she said softly, avoiding his gaze. "Thank you for letting me. Well, you know." He waved it off. No apology needed. Long flights can be rough on anyone. He did not push her to share more, but something about his gentle manner made Annie feel safe enough to speak. She did not plan on telling him anything personal, but the words started spilling out. She mentioned she was traveling for an important meeting. She avoided the full truth, though, and just said she had to see a lawyer about family matters. David nodded as if he understood something bigger. He asked no prying questions, only giving her space to speak as much or as little as she wanted. They kept chatting in a soft tone. Annie learned that David was heading to Seattle for business. She also found out he was the CEO of a company, though he did not brag about it. Instead, he seemed almost shy when she asked. She guessed he was far wealthier than she would ever be. He was polite, never looking down on her or making her feel small. It made her wonder how someone like him could be so kind. Was there a reason behind his empathy? By the time they landed, Annie felt more awake but also anxious. She had a meeting with a lawyer the next day, and she had no hotel booked. She told David she planned on finding an inexpensive motel near the airport. He seemed concerned, but he did not push her to change her mind. Instead, he asked if she wanted a ride from the airport. She hesitated, not wanting to impose, but she had little money for a taxi. She finally agreed, grateful for his offer. David's town car pulled up outside, and Annie blinked at how nice it was. The leather seats felt smoother than anything she had ever known. A driver took their bags. She had only her old suitcase, and she felt embarrassed again, but David just gave her a relaxed smile and opened the car door for her. On the ride, he asked if she wanted to grab a quick meal. Annie's stomach was grumbling, but she only had enough cash to cover a cheap sandwich. She tried to decline politely. David insisted, saying he was hungry, too, and that it would be his treat. She finally agreed. They stopped at a small restaurant, not too fancy, but well-kept. There, over warm soup and bread, David told her a bit more about his life. He had grown up in Seattle, but moved away after a family tragedy. His sister, Ave, had died. He did not share many details at first. Yet the sadness in his eyes grew deeper when he mentioned her. Annie felt a pang of sympathy, even though she barely knew him. She reached out and gently touched his hand. "I'm so sorry," she said quietly. He nodded, his throat tight. "I wish I could have done more," he whispered. "I keep thinking if I had listened more carefully, if I had done something." He trailed off, and Annie's chest tightened. She knew the pain of losing someone, too. Though her situation was different, her child was still alive. She felt as though she had lost Maris to a legal system that did not see her worth. She recognized the ache of guilt and regret in David's voice. For a brief moment, they sat in silence, each lost in their own grief. But the moment passed when David cleared his throat and changed the subject. He asked Annie about her day, her hopes, what brought her to Seattle. She paused, unsure if she should tell him the truth. Yet there was a feeling she could trust him. She explained she was on her way to meet with a lawyer about regaining custody of her daughter. She mentioned how her estranged husband had blocked her at every turn, using lies and connections to keep her away from Maris. "It's been so hard," she said, her voice cracking. "All I want is a chance to be with Maris again. I want to make sure she's safe, but I keep hitting walls. I don't have money for fancy lawyers, and every job I work just covers food and rent. If I lose this case, I lose her forever." David listened quietly. Then he said something that surprised her. "Annie," he began, "I know we just met. But if you need help, legal help, I have contacts in Seattle. I'd be glad to see if someone can assist you." Her first response was panic. She did not want to owe anyone, especially someone she barely knew. And she was sure wealthy men often offered things with strings attached. She had seen it happen. She tensed, preparing to turn him down. But David saw her hesitation. He quickly explained that he had no motive other than to help her if he could. "I remember how alone I felt when I lost Ave," he said quietly. "I wish I had found someone who could have guided me, told me what steps to take. Maybe it would not have changed the end, but it might have helped me deal with my grief in a better way. I can't fix everything, but I might be able to connect you with people who can help. No strings attached." She studied his face. She did not sense any trick. There was no hint of cruelty or hidden scheme. He only looked sincere. Still, doubt lay deep in her heart. She had been hurt by promises before. Yet something about David's quiet kindness eased her worries, at least a little. She thought about Maris. She would do anything for her daughter. She might have to take a leap of faith, even if it scared her. "Okay," Annie said at last, her voice shaky. "I'll consider your offer. Thank you." David smiled with relief. He glanced at his phone. "I'll make a few calls tomorrow. We'll see what can be done." That night, Annie stayed at a small motel near downtown Seattle. David had insisted on paying for a safer place, but Annie refused. She did not want to accept too much from him. When she arrived at her room, she sank onto the bed and stared at the flickering lamp overhead. The day had been long, but it held a glimmer of hope she had not felt in a while. A part of her worried about letting David help. She feared he might turn out to be like Damon, controlling and manipulative. But David did not remind her of her ex at all. Instead, he seemed gentle. Her mind drifted to how she had fallen asleep on his shoulder, and how he had not pushed her away or mocked her. Maybe, just maybe, good men did exist. She thought about her daughter, Maris. Closing her eyes, she remembered the day Damon stormed out of their small apartment, dragging Maris with him. She had cried and pleaded, but he had used his connections to get a quick order giving him temporary custody. Annie had been left with no car, no home, and almost no hope. She took a shaky breath, determined to fight for her child. This was her chance. Early the next morning, Annie dressed in her simple blouse and skirt. They were the best clothes she owned that still fit her. She rode a bus across town to meet with her lawyer, Mrs. Green. Outside the old building, she almost turned around. The nerves ate at her. She knew Damon would pull every trick to keep her from Maris. She could almost hear his mocking laughter, the same laugh she heard when he threatened her the night before she left. But she had come too far to stop now. Mrs. Green greeted her kindly. She was an older woman with a warm smile, but her eyes turned serious when Annie explained how Damon had threatened her. They discussed the hearing set for 2 days from now. The lawyer warned that Damon's legal team was strong and that they might have new claims to paint Annie as an unstable parent. Annie's stomach twisted with fear, but she kept going. "I have someone who might help pay for extra legal support," Annie said hesitantly. "He has contacts, too. Should I try to bring him in?" Mrs. Green nodded. "If he's as well connected as you say, it could help. But I do want to make sure he's trustworthy. You never know." Annie's heart pounded. She realized she still had to face Damon's cruelty in the courtroom, but maybe with a stronger team, she had a chance. That afternoon, David met Annie at a coffee shop near the law office. He sat at a corner table, reviewing some documents on a tablet. When she entered, he stood up, looking more like a friend than a distant millionaire CEO. He offered her a chair and asked about the lawyer's advice. She told him everything, from the hearing date to Mrs. Green's concern. David nodded and made a few calls right there. Annie watched in awe as he spoke to someone about connecting her with an expert in custody cases. He also offered to pay for the extra fees if it meant improving her chances of success. Her cheeks flushed with a mix of gratitude and shame. "I don't know how I'll repay you," she said, her voice trembling. "Don't worry about that," David replied. "Let's first make sure you get your daughter back. Then we can talk about repayment if needed. My priority is helping you and Maris." Annie swallowed hard, tears stinging her eyes. She was not used to such kindness. She said a quiet thank you, and David gave a small nod, as if to say it was no big deal. They spent the next hour talking about strategy. David had a surprising grasp of legal procedures, though he was not a lawyer himself. Annie learned he had spent years studying contracts and legal details for his company. If he wanted something done, he usually knew which doors to knock on. She felt some of her worry lift. Then the conversation shifted to David's past. She asked gently if he wanted to share more about Avenue. She could see the pain in his eyes. Slowly, he opened up. He told her that Ave had struggled with anxiety and sadness for years. He had tried to help, but he was often busy running his company, traveling, focusing on big deals. He found out too late just how fragile she was. One day, Ave sent him a text telling him she felt alone. David was in a meeting and could not pick up. By the time he called her back, she had taken her own life. The guilt that David felt had never gone away. He believed if he had taken her call or recognized the signs earlier, maybe he could have saved her. Annie felt tears roll down her cheeks. She reached for David's hand. "I'm so sorry," she said. "It's not your fault." He let out a long breath. "I know, logically, that she had deeper issues. But my heart won't let me forget that I might have done more." A wave of understanding passed between them. They had both lost someone dear. Though Annie's daughter was still alive, she had been torn away in another sense. They both felt the sting of loss and the heavy weight of regret. Annie realized then that David's kindness was no act. He was a man still mourning and seeking a way to give meaning to his pain. Helping her and Maris was, perhaps, his way to heal a part of himself. Over the next few days, David introduced Annie to a top custody lawyer who agreed to work with Mrs. Green. The lawyer met with Annie several times, gathering all evidence that would show she had a stable life, or at least as stable as she could make it with her limited means. They had witnesses who could testify that she worked 2 jobs and lived a clean life free from any wrongdoing. They even found neighbors who were willing to state Annie was a loving mother who had been forced away from her daughter unfairly. Meanwhile, Damon tried to push back. He reached out to Annie with threatening phone calls, telling her she was wasting her time. He left angry messages, accusing her of lying and telling her that no judge would believe a broke woman over a well-off father. Each call made Annie's heart pound with fear, but she clung to the courage that David's support had sparked in her. She recorded the calls. The legal team said they could use them to show Damon's underhanded tactics. David stayed by her side, offering advice whenever she needed it. He also opened up about his own nightmares, how he still saw Ave in his dreams, blaming him for not doing enough. Annie tried to be there for him too, letting him know that holding on to guilt would not bring Ave back. She encouraged him to think of ways to honor her memory instead. Maybe he could start a foundation or do something to help others who struggled like Ave had. David seemed to consider the idea. They grew closer as the hearing approached, and he realized she was not just grateful to David, she was beginning to care about him. He was not the stern, emotionless businessman she had expected. He was a kind, wounded soul who wanted to do good. Annie felt her heart stir with new hope, not only for her custody fight, but also for the chance at love she never thought she would feel again. On the morning of the hearing, Annie stood outside the courtroom wearing the same blouse and skirt she had worn for her first meeting with Mrs. Green. Her hands trembled. This was it. If she lost, she did not know how she would go on. She clutched Maris's pink hair ribbon in her hand, feeling its worn fabric against her palm. David stood beside her, his gaze steady, as if silently telling her she would not face this alone. They entered the courtroom. Damon sat at the other table with his sharp-dressed lawyer. He shot Annie a smug glance. She tried to keep her eyes forward, refusing to let him see her fear. The hearing began. Each side presented arguments. Annie's lawyers spoke of her dedication, her multiple jobs, her willingness to provide a safe home for Maris. They shared witness statements and the recorded phone calls in which Damon threatened Annie. Then Damon's lawyer tried to paint Annie as unstable, claiming she lacked financial security. They said Maris was better off with Damon. At one point, Damon stood up, claiming Annie had a habit of lying and that she was the one who left them. Annie's anger burned, but she kept silent. She let her lawyers respond. David sat behind Annie, frowning at every false claim. Finally, the judge called both lawyers to approach the bench. Annie's heart thumped. David rested a hand on her shoulder for support. Moments later, the lawyers returned, looking serious. The judge requested to hear from Annie directly. Her throat went dry as she walked to the stand. She spoke honestly. She told the court she had never abandoned Maris. She explained how Damon had left, taking Maris, and used his family's connections to block her. She explained she was working 2 jobs to make ends meet, and while she was not rich, she could provide Maris with love, stability, and a safe environment. Her voice cracked as she talked about how much she missed her child. Tears rolled down her face when she said she would do anything to protect Maris's well-being. When she finished, she could see David in the gallery, his expression full of sympathy and support. Annie tried not to cry again. She needed to be strong. The judge asked if there was any final evidence. Annie's lawyer introduced one more witness, a former friend of Damon's, who had heard him boast about how he had set Annie up to look bad during their initial separation. The friend confirmed that Damon had used false documents to show Annie was unfit. Gasps filled the courtroom, and Damon's face turned red. He tried to object, but the judge allowed the testimony. At last, the judge called for a short recess before giving a decision. The wait felt endless. Annie stood in the hallway with David and her lawyers. She did not speak, just clutched David's hand for comfort. Damon glared from across the hall, his lawyer whispering frantically in his ear. All the noise felt distant to Annie. She only thought of Maris and the chance to hold her again. Finally, everyone was called back. The judge cleared his throat. He stated that based on the evidence, Annie had shown she was a responsible mother who was kept from her child by unfair means. He criticized Damon for manipulating the legal process. In a firm voice, the judge granted Annie custody of Maris, with visitation rights for Damon under strict supervision. Annie's heart stopped for a second, then pounded with joy. She heard David let out a breath beside her. She turned, tears streaming, and embraced him. A cheer rose from her legal team. Damon stood speechless, his face twisted with anger. But it was over. Annie had won. Outside the courtroom, Annie took a shaky breath. David was still there, smiling at her gently. "You did it," he said. "Maris is coming home to you." She felt tears of relief on her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered. "I never could have done this without you." He shook his head. "You did the hard work. I only made a few calls." She laughed through her tears. "You did more than that, David. You stood by me. You believed in me." They walked outside, and the sun felt brighter than before. Annie's lawyer assured her that Maris would be brought to Seattle later that day, once the paperwork was processed. She could not wait to hold her daughter after so many long months. "I want to meet her," David said, smiling. "If that's okay with you." "It's more than okay," Annie replied, feeling her heart bloom with happiness. That evening, Annie stood in a small park near the courthouse, the wind blowing lightly. She spotted a social worker approaching with a little girl in hand. Maris had the same dark hair, though it was now longer, brushing past her shoulders. Annie felt her chest tighten, tears welling up again. When Maris saw her, she broke into a run and jumped into Annie's arms. "Mommy," Maris cried. Annie hugged her, pressing her face into Maris's hair. She sobbed, but they were tears of joy. She kissed her daughter's cheek and told her how much she loved her. Maris's small arms wrapped around her neck, as if never wanting to let go. For a while, they just stayed there, mother and daughter reunited at last. After a moment, Annie turned to see David watching from a respectful distance. She beckoned him closer. Maris looked at him with wide eyes. Annie explained that David was a friend who had helped them. David knelt down, smiling gently, and told Maris it was nice to finally meet her. The little girl nodded shyly, but she gave him a tiny smile in return. In the weeks that followed, Annie settled into a modest apartment in Seattle, paid for partly by her own savings and partly by help from David. She did not want to rely on him forever, but until she could find stable work, she appreciated his kindness. She found part-time office work that would let her be home for Maris in the afternoons. She also continued to pick up small gigs here and there. Life was still hard in some ways, but she had her daughter, and that made all the difference. David visited often, bringing groceries or little gifts for Maris, a puzzle, a set of crayons. He never acted pushy or assumed he could come whenever he wished. He would call and ask if it was okay, and he realized she liked having him around. Maris did, too. He would read her stories or help her with her homework. Annie sometimes caught herself watching David with her daughter, a warm feeling growing in her chest. Over time, Annie and David's bond deepened. They began sharing quiet dinners, then weekend outings. They visited the zoo, took walks by the water, and explored parks together. One day, Maris grabbed David's hand as they strolled, and Annie felt a sudden rush of gratitude. It felt like they were family, something Annie had not dared to imagine since losing Maris in the custody battle months ago. David also took steps to heal from Ave's death. He started a small fund in her name to help people with mental health support. Annie helped him organize a simple fundraiser, and they raised money that would go to clinics in low-income areas. Each time David talked about Ave now, there was a little less sadness in his eyes and a bit more hope. He told Annie that helping her and Maris had given him a new sense of purpose, a way to turn his guilt into something positive. Yet, there was one last moment of suspense. 2 months after the court victory, Damon tried to stir trouble again. He claimed Annie was violating the custody terms by letting Maris spend time with David. He went to a judge to demand an emergency hearing, saying David had a suspicious influence on Maris. For a day, Annie feared the worst. But this time, the judge saw through Damon's lies. There was no evidence that David posed any harm to the child. In fact, a social worker testified that Maris was thriving in Annie's care. The judge dismissed Damon's claims. Damon left the courthouse that day with fury in his eyes, but he was powerless to change the outcome. Annie realized that while she might face more threats or attempts from him, his grip on her life was fading. She had legal backing now, and David's steady presence gave her the courage she needed to stand strong. One summer evening, after Maris had gone to bed, Annie and David sat on the small apartment balcony. The air was warm, and the sounds of night traffic drifted up from the street. They sipped tea in silence. Then David set his cup down and took Annie's hand. "I've been thinking," he said softly. "You and Maris are a huge part of my life now. I never expected to feel like this again, but I care about you both so much." Annie felt tears building. She thought of how far they had come since that day on the plane. She remembered how she had fallen asleep on his shoulder, unaware that her life was about to change. She turned to him with a trembling smile. "I care about you too," she said. "You've given us hope, and not just because of your help with the court case. You've helped me believe in trust again." They leaned closer. In that moment, surrounded by the soft glow of the city lights, they kissed for the first time. It was a gentle kiss, filled with all the emotions they had carried for so long: pain, fear, hope, and finally love. From there, David spent more nights at Annie's place, reading bedtime stories to Maris or simply sharing dinner. Annie insisted that he not pay for everything, so they made a system. She bought groceries, he cooked dinner, and they split anything else. David admired her independence, and Annie found herself relaxing enough to accept help without feeling guilty. They became a team in a way she had never experienced before. Maris grew more attached to David. She called him Uncle David at first, but one night she asked Annie if it was okay to call him Dad. Annie's eyes filled with tears, and she told her daughter that was a special title, but if Maris wanted to, she could. Maris tried it out shyly. David was overwhelmed with emotion. He explained to Maris that he was honored, but he never wanted to replace her real father unless that was what she needed. Maris nodded, seeming to understand, and gave him a tight hug. Annie watched this with her heart ready to burst. Weeks turned into months, and the three of them found a rhythm. Annie's custody was secure. David's guilt over Ave had lessened, and together they were discovering a happiness none of them thought possible. One late afternoon, after picking Maris up from school, Annie and David took her to a nearby playground. While Maris ran around with other children, David drew Annie aside and gently pulled a small box from his pocket. She felt her breath catch as he opened it, revealing a simple, elegant ring. His hand shook slightly. "Annie," he said, voice trembling, "I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" For a moment, time stopped. Annie's mind flashed through all the struggles, the threats from Damon, the fear of losing Maris, the lonely nights. And then she saw the love in David's eyes, the hope he offered, the healing she had found by his side. Tears fell as she answered. "Yes," she breathed. "Yes, David." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and they both laughed with joy, tears shining in their eyes. Maris noticed the commotion and came running over. She asked what was happening, and David lifted her in his arms, telling her that he and her mom were going to get married. Maris clapped and hugged them both, giggling excitedly. That night, they returned to the small apartment that no longer felt cramped, but cozy. Their home. Annie tucked Maris into bed, telling her she loved her. The girl fell asleep with a smile on her face. When Annie came back to the living room, David was waiting with open arms. They sat on the couch, her head on his shoulder. This time she was wide awake, but the memory of that first flight came back to her. "Remember the plane?" she said softly, a smile crossing her face. "That was the day you first let me lean on you." He smiled. "I'll never forget it. It was the day my life changed. I guess you fell asleep on me then, and now I'm the one leaning on you." Annie's eyes filled again, but these were tears of gratitude and joy. "Thank you for helping me get my daughter back. Thank you for letting me in and for sharing your pain about Avenue. I hope we can honor her memory together." David nodded. "We will. And thank you for showing me there's still goodness to hold on to, no matter how bad things have been." They sat there for a while, letting the warmth between them speak louder than words. Outside, the city lights glowed in the night sky, but inside this small home, a new kind of light shone, a light of hope, love, and the promise of a second chance. The journey had been long. They had faced heartbreak, fear, and loss. Yet here they were, ready to build a life together, ready to give Maris the loving family she deserved. Annie let out a deep breath. She felt she had been holding since the day Damon first threatened her. She was finally free to embrace a new beginning. And that night, as she drifted to sleep in David's arms, Annie knew that the dark chapters of her life were behind her. In their place stood a story of resilience, love, and healing. A story that would guide her forward into a brighter tomorrow.